get started with today's episode, I would like to quickly read you our podcast disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not to substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. You should always speak with your physician or other healthcare professionals before doing any fasting, changing your diet in any way, taking or adjusting any medications or supplements, or adopting any treatment plan for a health problem. The use of any other products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Any information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. All right, and now we'll get started with today's episode.
Welcome back to the Fasting Method podcast. This is Coach Terri Lance, and once again, I am joined by Coach Heather Shuker. How are you today, Heather?
I am doing great, Terri. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm very excited because I know that you and I are going to get to continue our discussion about motivation. What listeners don't know is that we talk about this stuff behind the scenes and we get all excited, and then we have so much stuff that we want to say, and then how are we going to share all of this? So we decided to break it down a little bit from our last conversation. And so today, Heather, what I was hoping that we could do was to kind of illuminate a little bit more about why motivation is such a complicated thing. I think we accomplished that task last time, and that we can't just rely on the overall concept of motivation to carry us through. So what is it that's going on in our brain, in our body? What is motivation, and why is it so complicated for us? And Heather, I know you have a really important, I think, way to kind of get this conversation started. So, Heather, what is it that's going on in our brain? What are we trying to accomplish that is maybe not so obvious about what motivates us?
So, yes, Terri, I have a whole lot of thoughts about motivation. And first and foremost, I like to think about motivation in terms of, what is it? And it is kind of, how do we make ourselves want to? In any given situation, I want to do something. And how do I make myself want to? And a lot of times when it comes to, when I'm talking with clients, the issue comes up of deprivation. And they tell me I don't want to because I don't want to feel deprived. And that has me thinking of something that you've definitely talked about before and is a huge driving force in what motivates our brain. And that is something called loss aversion. And what that basically means is that as people, we really don't like to give up something that we already have. Once it's ours, we don't want to let go of it. And so when clients come to me and they're like, I just don't want to feel deprived, what they're saying is, currently, I can eat as much ice cream as I want, or whatever their food drug of choice is, and they don't want to let that go. That's something that they have now that they don't want to not have anymore. And I think what they're missing when it comes to that loss aversion is that there's a flip side to everything that we are eating and that we feel like we have, in that the things that we're eating that are not healthy for us is creating an opposite loss, like a loss that isn't in our face. So when we're consistently eating foods that make us unwell, then what we're actually losing is our health, our mobility, our longevity, but it's not in our face. And so when we are afraid of losing those instant gratification, highly palatable, highly addictive foods, we see that, but we don't see the health that we're not getting. It's not as clear, and so it doesn't feel as motivating.
So Heather, one of the ways I'm thinking about this, because sometimes it helps me to think of examples outside of the fasting and food examples, because I feel like so often we are so wrapped up in those that it's almost hard to separate out the emotion and things. Oftentimes when I hear about this concept of loss aversion, people always go to money examples. So let's say you have a financial planner and they say, Heather, if you do these things consistently, in 20 years, your money is going to grow this much. Why is it that we have a hard time taking those steps to do those things? Because we know 20 years from now, the money's going to grow to this big amount. This to me is about loss aversion. Because what's going to happen if I do these things now? It means I'm not going to frivolously spend my money today. It means that new pair of sunglasses that I saw that are on sale, I'm not going to get those. So it's going to require loss in the immediate in order to get to the gain in the future. And that's really how I see this playing out for so many of us, that the positive gains that you and I kind of dangle in front of people are further out into the future. But where does their brain go? What? I can't have an English muffin today? Mm-hmm. But to me, it's such a parallel. Because if you really talk to financial people, they will talk about, okay, especially if you put it on a credit card. If you put those sunglasses on a credit card, they're $50. By the time you pay them off, you will have spent $92 on them.
Right.
But if you took that $50 and put it into your investment in that amount of time, it will become $75 in your account. But where does our brain go? I don't want to have the discomfort of not having the sunglasses right now, even though the money will pay off down the road.
Yeah. Just so you know, Terri, a lifetime ago, I actually worked in the financial industry. And the general idea, if you want to make money in investing, is to buy low and sell high, right? That is what makes the most sense. But in context of loss aversion, let me just tell you what actually happens, what the human behaviors are when it comes to investing. When the market is low, that usually is a sign things are not going well in the financial markets, right? We're in a recession. Things are kind of falling. So if you're being objective, that means things are on sale. That's when you want to invest. But that's not how people see it. People are like, oh, everything's low. I should get out of the market. So all of that money they put in the market when it was going well, when it felt like a good idea to invest because things were climbing, they now want to pull out of the market when it's low because the market feels unsafe to them. And they don't want to lose any more of the money that they already had, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of how you're going to make money in investing. In investing, you've got to go counterintuitive to what feels correct. You need to be willing to put money in the market when it doesn't feel as safe, so that with compounding interest and with the time value of money, that it actually will grow in time at a higher return because you've bought at a lower price. And when it comes to loss aversion, it's very much like that. We don't want to give up our way of living when things feel safe and secure for us. So we hang on to it until things are really bad. Then we're ready to make a change.
Yeah, Heather, I think that's so exactly in line. If people can think about how does that kind of translate into their decisions about eating, what to eat, fasting. When the market is low, that's when we should invest more. That's when we should commit to our plans, decide what food works for our body and commit to it, even though that means giving up a little bit of our current lifestyle, with this hope that our lifestyle is going to pay off in the future. And I think this is part of why many of us struggle with this too, is it requires a little bit of what might feel like blind faith. But many of us have evidence from the past that it doesn't work and won't work. And even if it works short term, I can't hang on to it. So Heather and Terri, you can talk about all your future magnificent outcomes, but I'm afraid to let go of what feels pretty secure and a given right now.
That is exactly what I was getting at, Terri. Thank you for, narrowing that into the topic at hand, which is our lifestyle changes. And, it all comes back to the whole concept of instant gratification versus delayed gratification. It is so difficult when the instant gratification temptations are right in front of you to keep your mind in that delayed gratification place. But the reality is that all the biggest things that we want, all of those huge goals that are so satisfying, that feel like we're making progress, that just make us feel alive as humans, that have a vision and can accomplish big things, those are all in the delayed gratification space. Instant gratification is not where any of the kind of hard-earned wins, that's not where they can be found.
Absolutely. And Heather, you are just leading right into more psychological principles, the pleasure principle. We can thank our friend Sigmund Freud for this, but the idea that people are hardwired, are motivated to seek immediate gratification and avoid pain. And throw in another one here, Thorndike's law of effect. And this supposes that all animals, including humans, are hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So, if I think about decreasing my carbs, you just took away my pleasure and you increased my pain. Why in the heck would I want to do this, Heather? Man, you coaches are just cruel.
Well, yeah, that's it. I don't think that our brains were designed with our long-term goals in mind. They were designed to keep us safe and alive, and our long-term goals were a secondary benefit, which requires us to use our, more advanced brains, like the prefrontal cortex that we developed that can override that, intrinsic basal, need to avoid pain rather than, have as much pleasure-seeking motivation wrapped up within us. Because the part of our brain that is capable of putting in the applied effort to do great things has to be able to kind of forego those instant pleasure things. That's just necessary for any big goal.
Well, Heather, since we're talking about the brain, I think it's important to talk a little bit about, as you said, the survival piece is so important. And I emphasize this in my master classes till I am blue in the face. Our brain is not really motivated by the niceties of the future. It is motivated by the survival in the moment, hence the avoidance of pain. And I know that not eating in this moment can lead to something better in my future, but to my brain, that is pain, that is discomfort, and that triggers me to want to act in a way that's not going to serve me well. So like you said, that immediate gratification rather than the delayed gratification. So you're also touching here, Heather, on, our favorite brain part, the amygdala. And I'm curious, if you have some thoughts about just kind of how is it that the amygdala adds to this challenge with motivation?
Yeah. First of all, the amygdala is such a fascinating portion of our brain. And, much as we often think negatively about it because of how it can get in the way of reaching our goals, right? We often talk about the lizard brain as being part of the problem, right? The insulin beast comes, here's the lizard brain. All of this is working against us in making these choices. But of course, it is a very critical structure in our brain, right? Having that structure in our body and that fear is what has kept us alive. And it is so important that there is another structure in our brain, the hippocampus, which is involved more with memory, that is actually has close proximity to the amygdala. And one believes that the reason for that closeness and for that kind of linkage between memory and that lizard brain that kind of drives fear is because it's so paramount to our survival. And part of, what the effects of is that when we have something pleasurable happen, that's nice. When there is something that happens that terrifies us, that really fills us with fear, boom, is a memory laid down strong. That amygdala fires, that hippocampus gets that information, and it is set in stone in your brain, because things that happen to us that cause severe fear could be very dangerous. We want to remember what caused that to happen so that we can avoid it later. So our brains, much as it feels like something that we have to overcome, it's something that has kept us safe for millennia. And so as we talk about this in the context of motivation, some of this, like we were talking about earlier with loss aversion and, not wanting to have discomfort in the present, those are based in fear. And fear is a really powerful motivator, anti-motivator sometimes, but motivator for certain behaviors. And that is something that is difficult to overcome, but possible.
Absolutely. And to share just one more piece of the complexity of the role our brain plays in this, without jumping into biohacking, is that in studying this seeking pleasure versus avoiding pain, they have identified a part of the brain that moderates that. And there are two neurotransmitters at play, GABA, and that GABA affects the reward neurons, so seeking pleasure. And glutamate affects the kind of punishment. It turns these things off to avoid pain. We have a chemistry set going on in our brain at all times, and we think I'm just going to talk myself into wanting to do this. And I guess I really just wanted to emphasize, it's not that we can't do things to help with motivation, but we can't rely on just thinking, I'm going to want this and it's going to happen. Because again, this whole internal system feels a little bit rigged to really complicate the motivation scene.
Terri, I love that you just brought that up. The whole idea of trying to talk ourselves into feeling more motivated in the moment, like we're somehow going to, structure a little internal debate. Like, Heather, you are absolutely going to feel motivated to go do this thing right now. And here are this is my 5-point plan and making you do so. And who does that work for? It is a losing strategy to try and, verbally, internally convince yourself to do these things, because of that kind of cornucopia of neurotransmitters that it might be working against you in that moment. I like to equate that as trying to have a conversation with someone of opposing political beliefs and trying to talk them into your side. Like, how often does that work? It usually doesn't. I truly believe sometimes that's the same kind of, futile conversation that we're having with ourselves. All is not lost, though. Like, we can do more than have an internal conversation when it comes to this stuff. Actually, our bodies can, even though we have these neurotransmitters that are kind of leading us in a certain way, there are things that we can do to alter the concentration of those neurotransmitters in our brain. So if that doesn't mean sit down and have a conversation with yourself, what does that mean? Well, that means do actual physical things that changes what your neurotransmitters are doing, which is something that we can all do. What do those things look like that actually in the moment change your neurotransmitters? Well, taking a walk will absolutely change what is being released in your brain. Meditation, there is great evidence that once you drop into your body, that is going to kind of simmer down some of those highly inflammatory neurotransmitters. And even a hug, right? Hugging a partner, hugging a dog, that physical contact. Boom, here comes some neurotransmitters to change your physical state of being. And once you've gone from being up in your head and trying to change yourself there to changing your actual body, how your body is relating to the world, then that new feeling that you have, that new physical feeling, can start to change your way of thinking. And in fact, that seems to be a more direct course of action to change your thoughts, is to actually change your actions first.
Couple others I was thinking about as you were describing those. Breath work is a great one. Sleep. We can improve our sleep to help change how our neurotransmitters are working. And even what we eat greatly affects what neurotransmitters are made, how they're moved throughout our system. Do they get to the brain? We have a lot of impact on this, more so than just talking ourselves into feeling motivated. And the other one, Heather, I think really ties back to your example that you experience in working with clients, and that is learning to highlight the positives of what you're achieving rather than focusing on the losses, the deprivation, the what you're giving up. So for example, I recently, about 4 or 5 months ago, gave up sugar. And it would be easy for me to focus on, oh, Thanksgiving is coming and I can't have this, or I'm not going to be able to eat this out of my stocking this year, or whatever. But instead to be focusing on, wow, I have so many fewer cravings. It's crazy. It's crazy how I think about eating, how I think about food has been shifting. So focusing, highlighting those positive things I'm getting from these decisions, rather than focusing on the discomfort, the inconvenience of it.
I couldn't agree more. And I know we are going to talk in a future episode about all of the ways that we can improve our motivation. And what you're describing is certainly one of them, which is celebrating the wins and focusing on what's going right instead of what we're giving up, so to speak. But I cannot help but say, I could say this in every single episode because I think it's so important, that if this is something that you're struggling with out there, if your motivation is waning and you are, just fighting yourself about this thing, then like Terri said, focus on how you're winning and the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis that's moving you toward that big goal in the future that feels far away. Bring it to today. And instead of, I got 100 pounds to lose, today I'm going to do this action that will eventually move me in that direction, and celebrate that action. That is where your power is. It's in today. It's in these moments, not the next 6 months, but right now, and then celebrate it because, we're talking about neurotransmitters. We're talking about adjusting how they're released. Well, one of the things that we want to release is dopamine. That's our motivating neurotransmitter. And we can push dopamine. We talk about it a lot about being a bad thing, but when it comes to getting ourselves going, it's a really good thing. And when we reward ourselves, whether mentally high-fiving, giving ourselves a gold star for the actions that we take to move toward our goals, we crave that reward. We crave that feeling we got when we acted in such a way that was moving us toward our goals. And that's something that you can kind of count on a day-to-day basis to pump your motivation. So I highly recommend it.
And I'm going to chime in with a really quick little example here. And I know we're going to talk about this in more detail, as you said, but I have recently started working with a personal trainer. And when I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, I don't contact the person. I lay low. But in the past week, regularly reaching out, it's a long distance thing. So I message them and say, this is what I did today. This is what I experienced. It is motivating. That is getting the momentum going. And I haven't made any progress that is measurable yet as far as long-term goals. But that's okay because it's the changing the momentum right now that is motivating. All right, Heather, I know you and I could talk about this for about another 5 hours and still not cover all of the thoughts that we have. But we're going to let people digest this, start working on these things, and we're going to come back with another episode getting into some more specifics about how we think people can help themselves with this motivation piece. And I think even sharing some of our own examples of how we have used motivation, how we've built motivation, and how we've done things even when the desire didn't feel strong enough.
I can't wait, Terri, because you're absolutely right. I'm holding myself back from the diatribe that I want to go in as far as, how we can help everybody get their motivation in check and to keep moving. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about this in the future as well.
Great. All right, everyone, you heard it. We're going to come back with yet another episode on motivation. So until then, take good care, and we'll be back soon with another episode.